Hello and welcome back to the second part of the reproductive system lecture. And in this lecture, your learning outcomes are to understand the functional anatomy of the male and female reproductive organs. Well, I'm sure all of you are very experts already here, so I don't think I need to go in detail. And then to discuss the hormonal regulation of reproductive function in males. But most importantly, I would like for you to understand that the plasma hormone levels are cyclic, and that is why the menstrual cycle is the way it actually is. And hopefully you can appreciate better what happens in the body. And boys, you can then also sympathize with what our female colleagues actually experience, and be a bit more sensitive when you say things like, oh, you are hormonal. Women, if anyone ever tell you that, you say, yes, you are hormonal. And there's nothing wrong, because it's absolutely normal for your hormones to actually be cyclical and varying. So this is the male reproductive system, and essentially it consists of the testes, the internal genitalia, which are the glands, the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, the bulboureterial gland, the vas deferens, the ejaculatory ducts, and essentially the external genitalia are your penis and the scrotum. And when you cut the testis into half, ouch, you can then get a very beautiful cross section of the seminiferous tubules that are encapsulated inside the testis. And in these seminiferous tubules, what you will see is basically many different types of cells. Number one, you actually have some capillaries, because you need blood and nutrients and oxygen to be provided to these cells. But what you have here are the Leydig cells, right? The Sertoli cells, and between two Sertoli cells, you will actually have the spermatogonium, which is essentially the precursor of stem cells to actually make your sperm cells, as you can see here. And these Leydig cells, they produce the testosterone, all right, that's actually needed, that then tells the stem cells, okay, start making sperms. And these Sertoli cells, they provide all the developmental support that meiosis needs to occur in the spermatogenesis, right? So they secrete the proteins that is needed, and the various different types of fluids and lubricants. So the testis is consisting of seminiferous tubules, as I mentioned, and that's where the sperm is actually produced. But you don't actually have to go in greater detail. And in this slide, you get an understanding of what the different cells actually do. And essentially, the Leydig cells is the hormone cells, the testosterone. The Sertoli cells is the one that actually support and produce all kinds of materials, including the blood testis barrier, to ensure that your antibodies don't attack your sperms. So this is the sperm cell, and as you can see, a sperm cell contains three distinct regions. It's got this bulb head, right? And then it's got this middle piece, and then it's got its tail. Essentially, the head contains the nucleus, and a specific vesicle called the acrosome, and we'll be talking about this acrosome later on. And this acrosome contains specific enzymes and proteins. And then you have the midpiece here that actually contains mitochondria. And this is really important, because this is how the sperm will actually produce ATP, and the ATP is then allows this tail to then move up and down, sideways like a whip, that gives the sperm cells their motility. And as you can see, the semen that's actually produced by the various different secretory glands will provide the mucus, the lubricant, the nutrients, even fructose, citric acid, vitamin C, carnitine. So all the different things that is actually needed, to allow the sperm to swim up into the cervix and then in the uterus, so that it can actually fertilize the egg. This is the hormonal control of spermatogenesis. Essentially, I would ask you to focus on the right side, which is where when there's an increase in the gonadotropin releasing hormone, you actually have an increase in FSH and LH, as we have talked about the HPG axis. FSH will target the Sertoli cells that will increase will initiate the spermatogenesis. And the increased expression of inhibin will have a negative feedback onto the FSH secretion. The LH will act on the Leydig cells, and the Leydig cells, as you know, is to produce testosterone. And this testosterone then, in combination with Sertoli cells, will stimulate the production of spermatogenesis, but also increase the level of plasma testosterone, which will also provide some feedback. And this plasma testosterone will obviously go to other parts of the body, and that's where you increase your muscle, you increase your various different secondary characteristics. So the rate of sex hormone secretion in the male remains fairly constant throughout the reproductive life of the male. However, over the long term, testosterone levels will rise dramatically during puberty, and so that surge during puberty is what increases the plasma testosterone levels to a level where then all the secondary characteristics like secondary hair, greater muscle, and the production of sperms is actually initiated. And it will continue to grow and reach a peak in the third decade of life, and subsequently, so people like me who just turned 40 years old will start to decline, from now on. So as I mentioned, the androgens, and especially because now the levels of testosterone now is high in the plasma, it's going to affect your body shape, your presence of secondary hair, muscular development, lowering of voice, and libido, which is sex drive. And when we talk about the female reproductive system, the female reproductive system essentially, as you know, covers the external genitalia, the clitoris, the vagina, and then you have all the different internal glands as well as organs, such as the uterus, the fallopian tube, and the ovaries. But what's important between the male and the female is that the reproductive female system undergoes monthly changes as part of a menstrual cycle. And the cycle begins with menstruation, which is marked by shedding of blood and tissue from the uterine lining. And this menstrual cycle is also a restricted period of time of only a few days where the ovum is released and can be fertilized. This particular event in which fertilization can actually occur occurs in the middle of the cycle, and it's also called ovulation. And as I mentioned earlier, most women will release about 400 ovaries during their lifetime, and when they stop, that's when you have menopause. So the uterus is composed of three tissue layers. A thin outer connective tissue layer that essentially covers the whole organ, and then you have a thick middle layer of smooth muscle, right? And this is the smooth muscle that sort of grows every month, and it's very, very critical during giving birth. Also, it contains a lot of materials. But the one that actually secretes and decides whether an implantation has occurred and supports the fetal development is the endometrium. And the endometrium, which is the innermost layer, consists of epithelium. So this is the endometrium here. Consists of epithelium with glands that will then dip into the connective tissues, and this thickness will change during the menstrual cycle. And cells of the epithelial lining will either proliferate and grow, or they will actually slough off, which means they leave or they detach. And that's usually the bleeding during menstruation. And then you actually have the fallopian tubes here, sorry, the fallopian tubes that are then connected to the ovaries. These fallopian tubes are essentially two layers of smooth muscle, and they're ciliated, so they actually have got these brush borders. Okay, and at the end of this, we have something called the fimbriae, which is essentially like a flat open. You can see this fimbriae here. This fimbriae at the end of the fallopian tube are like fingers that essentially help to ensure that the eggs that are released by the ovaries will go inside the tube and into the uterus. So as you know, the ovaries produces eggs and hormones, and when a baby is born, it already has got a set number of follicles that are ready to undergo meiosis 1 and meiosis 2 upon onset of puberty, as well as fertilization for meiosis 2. So when we talk about the menstrual cycle, I want you to focus on two cycles, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. So which means that this cycle happen in the ovaries as well as in the uterus itself. In the ovarian cycle, it's what we call as the follicular phase, is the first phase where the egg matures, where meiosis 1 begins to actually continue and essentially grow. So basically the egg grows, and that's what we call as follicular phase. And to remember, the egg is a follicle, so that's why it's follicular phase. And then there's the second phase, which is the ovulation phase. And this ovulation phase is when the follicles actually ripened and are released from the ovary. And so now the ovum or the oocyte is released from the ovary. That is called ovulation. And then what is left, the ruptured follicle, will then become what is known as corpus luteum, and we'll talk about its significance. And this corpus luteum is important during pregnancy, and it's called the luteal phase. So basically an ovary goes through a follicular phase, an ovulation phase, and a luteal phase. Whereas the uterus undergoes the uterine cycle, and it also has three phases. The first phase is menses, where there's the bleeding from the uterus and there's no pregnancy. And then the endometrium starts growing, and so that's called a proliferative phase. And finally, the endometrium has grown, and now the endometrium is not just a layer, but it also is secreting various different types of materials, and that is a secretory phase. So this image is exactly what I had just described to you. So you can actually see how essentially the eggs are actually growing, right? And so here is the follicular phase from stage 1 to 5. You can see that the follicle, the egg is actually growing bigger, right? So your oocyte now is a proper egg that has matured, okay? Essentially reaching, meiosis 1. And then this sort of primary follicle then ruptures, okay? And when it ruptures, this is what we call the process ovulation. And as it then travels, and usually ovulations on day 14, if day 1 is the day in which the specific follicle or primordial follicle is chosen to undergo ovulation. And so that takes 14 days. And then what will happen is this oocyte will start traveling into the fallopian tube and into the uterus. And if it gets implanted, fertilized and implanted, then there's a chance for pregnancy. But before we go there, I just want you to see is basically what will happen is that this follicle then becomes what is called a corpus luteum. And depending on whether the fertilization occurs, it will actually determine whether this corpus luteum is degenerated or not. But if there's no fertilization, this corpus luteum then slowly degenerates into what is called a corpus albicans and gets completely removed. And by the end of this, it will be 28 days. And when the corpus luteum becomes corpus albicans, it is time for day 1, where now another primordial follicle is chosen for ovulation. In the context of uterine cycle, so if you map it to the ovarian cycle here, okay, the follicular phase and luteal phase, you will see basically you have the menstrual phase in the early part of the follicular phase, where now you have menstruation, so all this blood actually comes out. And then you start growing the endometrial gland again. And then after the proliferative phase, it then starts the secretory phase, where now you not only have increase in blood vessels, you also have some glands and secretion of mucus and various different proteins and sugars, so that basically it becomes a really nice hotbed for the ovum to implant itself in the uterus. And if there is no what do you call that, ovulation, then what will happen is menstruation again happens. So you have menses here, and then it goes out again. So it's a very cyclical process per se. And why it's cyclical? It's because the expression of these hormones are also cyclical. And what are the hormones that are actually controlling? That's right, it follows the HPG axis again. And now instead of G being testosterone, it is estrogen, progesterone, and inhibins from the gonad. And what is the gonad in females? It's ovaries. So this particular graph, now overlays the whole menstrual cycle together with the uterine and the ovarian cycle. And you can see now the peaks of the hormones. So for example, you will notice that, let's use the green arrow. So you will notice that, for the primary follicle to start growing, what is it that's actually being initiated? Of course, the gonadotropic, gonadotropin releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. That will probably be somewhere here, high up here. And basically what will happen is that the presence of G and RH, right, will result in then a slight spike in the FSH. Can you see the slight spike? And it's this slight spike here that is enough to actually initiate the primary follicle to mature, right? So it goes mature enough. And then as the FSH drops, so the follicles then say, okay, I shouldn't grow now. Now I need to burst. There's a slight, after the drop, there's a spike and there's a release of the egg. And then you can see the amount has reduced, right? And continues to reduce. And essentially your corpus luteum becomes a corpus albicans. And you can see here as a cycle, it will start going up again. And if it goes up again, what will happen? A new follicle is then chosen to grow into an egg. With LH, you can see how the LH is actually quite the same, but then the LH surge happens just before ovulation. And that's why it's called luteinizing. So essentially the ovary, right, senses this luteinizing hormone spike. And as a result, basically the follicle luteinizes and releases the egg, and essentially then goes into corpus luteum phase, right, into the luteal phase. In terms of the then the hormones of the gonad, which is the ovarian hormones, let's use the purple color. So if you look at the hormones that are most involved in the follicular phase, it is the estrogen. So as you can see, the estrogen, just like the testosterone that's important for spermatogenesis, is important for the follicle growth, the gametogenesis. and then you actually have a dip in the estrogen. And although when the corpus luteum increases, there's a slight increase, but essentially if there is no implantation, it actually goes down. But what is interesting is that you will see how progesterone increases. Progesterone increases, after ovulation. Before that, it's actually quite low. But after ovulation, you actually will notice how the ovaries will express progesterone. And again, the numbers drop, if basically there is no implantation. What's also interesting is that you will notice that the increase in progesterone is also associated with the increase in basal body temperature. So you'll also notice that ovulation, also is associated with an increase in body temperature. And this is one of the ways in which if families are trying to find when is the best time to have babies and to understand the menstrual cycle, they also check the temperature. But as you can see, the temperature differences is very, very small. So you have to already know what the baseline is. So as you can imagine, all of this have got HPG axis that controls the GnRH, molecule, and the FSH and LH secretion, and finally, to the specific follicles and its activity. I don't think we need to go in great detail in your purpose, but try and appreciate how this control ultimately affects the hormone levels and how the surges and the dips, really can affect human behavior as well as perceptions. The effect of the levels of estrogen plays a very important role, especially in the follicular phase in the ovarian cycle. As you can see here, that at the early stages of the follicular growth, that the low levels of estrogen expression will have an effect on the cells to increase its level of estrogen, and that's why you see an increase in estrogen over time, right? But as the late follicular phase, is reached, you will see how the higher levels of estrogen now has an amplifying effect on the GPH axis. There's an increase in the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And so this is a positive feedback. And this is something important to realize, that what is essentially a negative feedback can become a positive feedback depending on the amount of estrogen levels that's actually in there. And as it moves to the early to mid luteal phase, what you will see is now that the follicles do not need to grow anymore. And so when it reaches a peak in the estrogen levels, and especially a peak in the luteinizing hormone levels, what will happen is that there is a negative feedback. And so therefore the follicular stage is stopped because you don't need to grow anymore. So no new follicles are actually being chosen for the growth. And essentially, as the late luteal phase, sort of occurs, what will happen is, especially if there was no pregnancy and implantation or fertilization, the estrogen levels and progestins drop. And what will happen is that this will stimulate the increase in gonadotropin releasing hormones, which will then start the new follicular development for a new cycle. So the hormones, really influence, also the female secondary sex characteristics. And so this includes the breast development, the distribution of fat towards the hips and upper thighs. So you can imagine that all of this is preparing a woman to give birth, right? Of course, according to her choice, all right? And they also produce androgens through the adrenal cortex, and that's when they develop pubic and axillary hair growth, and much like men, libido or sex drive. So for me, right, it's really important for you to truly appreciate, this particular graph, to see how these peaks and troughs and the drop in progesterones, really affect, the inner linings of the uterus, the ovary, production of egg, and preparing for the next ovulating cycle. But also start thinking about, how this might actually affect the psychological state, because as you know, this increase in levels of hormones in the plasma is also going to affect the other cells in our body, just like what testosterone does, and what adrenaline does. There will be an impact to many things, and it's because it covers the brain, it covers, the other types of cells in your body. So for learning outcome 2, I hope that you really understand the functional anatomy of male and female reproductive organs in the context of being able to understand how the hormones regulated. But the most important thing here is for you to appreciate the physiological changes that happen in a cyclical way because of the way these hormones are actually expressed cyclically.